Here's something that's going to sound absolutely ridiculous, but stay with me for a second. The banana, that cheap, yellow, slightly squishy fruit you grab at the checkout counter or toss in your kid's lunchbox without a second thought, that humble fruit almost caused a war. Actually, scratch that. It didn't almost cause a war, it caused several. It toppled governments, it enslaved entire nations, it fueled the rise of one of the most ruthless corporations in human history. It wiped out an entire species. Yes, an entire species once before. And right now, as you listen to this, it is on the verge of happening again. The banana you ate this morning, it is not the banana your grandparents ate. The banana on store shelves today is a completely different variety, a genetic clone actually, born from catastrophe, bred from desperation, and currently fighting for its own survival. And here's the truly unsettling part. Scientists are genuinely worried that within our lifetime, the banana as we know it could disappear entirely from supermarkets around the world. But this story isn't just about fruit. It's about empire, exploitation, revolution, and resilience. It's about how one plant became so deeply woven into human civilization that entire countries were literally named after it. Economies rose and fell because of it, and people were willing to die and to kill to control it. From the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia 10,000 years ago, to the plantations of Central America, to the laboratories of the 21st century, the history of the banana is, in many ways, the history of humanity itself. So let's peel back the layers, every single one of them. To understand where the banana comes from, we need to rewind the clock by about 10,000 years and travel to a region of the world that doesn't get nearly enough credit for shaping human history, the tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia, specifically the islands and peninsulas that today make up Papua New Guinea, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The wild ancestors of the banana were nothing like what you'd recognize today. They were full of large, hard seeds. Biting into one would have been like trying to eat a mouthful of gravel wrapped in starchy, fibrous pulp. Not exactly delicious. And yet, ancient peoples in this region did eat them. They roasted them, boiled them, scraped the pulp from around the seeds. And at some point, nobody knows exactly when or where, someone noticed a strange thing happening. Occasionally, a wild banana plant would produce fruit with fewer seeds. And sometimes, very rarely, a plant would produce fruit with almost no seeds at all. Soft, sweet, and edible without all the hassle. These people were not passive observers of nature. They were farmers, cultivators, experimenters. They began to selectively grow these unusual plants, propagating them not from seeds, but from the suckers, the little shoots that grow from the base of the plant. And this right here is one of the most important moments in agricultural history that almost nobody talks about. Because by doing this, those ancient farmers created the first seedless fruit in human history. The banana became humanity's first deliberately engineered food crop. Long before genetic modification, long before laboratories, humans were reshaping nature to suit their needs, and the banana was their first great success. The scientific name for the banana plant is Musa, and it belongs to a family called Musaceae. Most of the edible bananas we know today are descended from two wild species, Musa acuminata and Musa balbisiana. The sweetness and soft texture you associate with a ripe banana come primarily from Musa acuminata, while the starchier qualities of cooking bananas and plantains come largely from Musa balbisiana. Ancient farmers crossbred these two species both intentionally and accidentally, creating a dizzying variety of banana types that still exists today. There are over 1,000 known varieties of banana. That's right, 1,000. Most people in the Western world know exactly one. Once the banana had been domesticated in the jungles of Southeast Asia, it didn't stay there for long. It traveled. And the story of how it traveled is a story of human migration, trade, and exploration that played out over thousands of years. The earliest spread of the banana was tied to the remarkable seafaring peoples of the ancient Pacific, ancestors of today's Polynesian and Austronesian cultures. These were people who built outrigger canoes and sailed thousands of miles across open ocean with nothing but the stars to guide them. And when they sailed, they brought their food with them. Banana plants are uniquely suited for travel. You can carry a sucker, a small shoot from the base of the plant, wrap it in wet leaves, keep it alive for weeks, and plant it when you reach your destination. The banana was essentially portable agriculture. By around 5,000 years ago, bananas had spread westward from Southeast Asia into the Indian subcontinent. India would go on to become one of the great banana civilizations of the ancient world, developing hundreds of its own varieties, cooking traditions, and even religious practices centered on the fruit. In Hinduism, the banana plant is considered sacred. Its leaves are used in ceremonies, its fruit is offered to the gods, and its flour is used in cooking. To this day, India is the world's largest producer of bananas. From India, the banana spread westward into East Africa, likely carried by traders and sailors crossing the Indian Ocean. This is actually a matter of historical debate. Some scholars believe bananas reached Africa as early as 3,000 years ago. Others put the date closer to 2,000 years ago. But what's not in dispute is the impact. When bananas arrived in East Africa, they transformed agriculture there. They thrived in the warm, humid climate of the Great Lakes region, what is today Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, and became a dietary staple so deeply embedded in local culture that many East African languages have dozens of different words for different banana varieties and stages of ripeness. Then came the Arab traders. From roughly the 7th century onward, Arab merchants were the great connectors of the ancient world, moving goods and plants across trade routes stretching from East Africa to the Middle East to the Mediterranean. It is through Arab trade networks that the banana got its name. The word banana most likely comes from the Arabic word banan, meaning finger, and if you think about the shape of a banana and then look at your fingers, suddenly that etymology makes perfect sense. Here's where the story takes an interesting twist. For most of European history, the banana was a total mystery. The ancient Greeks and Romans, those great explorers and catalogers of the natural world, had barely a clue it existed. There are a few references in ancient texts. Alexander the Great reportedly encountered banana plants during his campaigns in India in the 4th century BC, and his companion Theophrastus, the father of botany, wrote about a large plant with remarkable fruit. But bananas never made it back to the Mediterranean in any meaningful way during the classical era. The first European to write about bananas with any real clarity was a Portuguese explorer and physician named Garcia de Horta, who published a detailed description of the fruit in 1563 after years of working in India. He described a fruit that was sweet, soft, and unlike anything known in Europe. He noted the locals ate them raw, cooked and dried. He was essentially writing the first European banana review, and it was glowing, but the Portuguese weren't just interested in eating bananas. They were interested in moving them. And this is where the banana's history takes a dark and terrible turn, because the Portuguese, like all the great colonial powers of the 15th and 16th centuries, were deeply invested in the Atlantic slave trade. And the banana became part of that trade, not as a commodity to sell, but as a food to feed enslaved Africans on the brutal transatlantic voyages known as the Middle Passage. Some historians believe the Portuguese may have deliberately introduced banana plants to West Africa as a cheap, calorie-dense food source for enslaved people before the voyage, and then carried the plants across the Atlantic to the Americas as a reliable food supply for the plantations. So the banana's arrival in the Western Hemisphere is not a story of innocent exploration. It is a story of colonialism, slavery, and exploitation, and that shadow never really lifts from the banana's history. From the very beginning of its journey to the Americas, It was entangled with power, suffering, and profit. The Americas already had their own wild banana relatives, plants that looked somewhat banana-like but were not true bananas. When the Portuguese and Spanish introduced actual Musa bananas to the Caribbean and Central America in the early 16th century, the plants took to the climate almost immediately. The warm, wet, tropical conditions were perfect. Within decades of introduction, bananas were growing across the Caribbean, along the coasts of South America, and throughout Central America. For much of the following 300 years, though, bananas remained a local curiosity in the Americas. They were eaten by the people who lived near where they were grown, mainly enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, and poor rural communities. They weren't exported, they weren't traded internationally, and there was a very simple reason for this: bananas rot. A ripe banana has a shelf life measured in days, not weeks. In an era before refrigeration, before fast transportation, before modern logistics, you couldn't put a banana on a sailing ship in Jamaica and expect it to arrive in good condition in London. It was basically impossible. And so for centuries, the banana stayed in the tropics. Travelers from Europe and North America who visited the Caribbean would occasionally mention tasting them, usually with great enthusiasm. They were sweeter than anything easily available in Northern Europe or North America at the time. They were exotic, beautiful, and strangely satisfying. But they were also, in the words of one 19th century traveler, stubbornly unwilling to travel. The banana seemed destined to remain a regional food, beloved where it grew, unknown everywhere else. What changed everything? Three things that arrived almost simultaneously in the second half of the 19th century: steamships, railroads, and a businessman from Maine who had absolutely no background in agriculture, but who saw something that nobody else had quite seen before: that the banana was not just a fruit, it was a fortune waiting to happen. His name was Minor C. Keith, and if you've never heard of him, you should have, because he is one of the most consequential and most controversial figures in the history of modern commerce. In the 1870s, Keith was working in Costa Rica, supervising the construction of a railroad that the Costa Rican government had commissioned to connect the interior of the country to the Atlantic coast. It was a brutal project. Thousands of workers, many of them immigrants and enslaved or coerced laborers, died during construction from disease, accidents, and sheer exhaustion. The Costa Rican government eventually ran out of money. Keith found himself stuck in a Central American jungle with miles of completed railroad, no customers, and enormous debt. So he had an idea. He would grow bananas along the railroad line. He would use the railroad, built with so much blood and suffering, to transport the bananas to the coast. He would ship them north to the ports of New Orleans and Boston, and he would sell them to Americans who had never tasted one. The timing was extraordinary. The steamship had by this point made the journey from Central America to the United States short enough, about a week, that bananas could actually survive the voyage in edible condition. Keith, along with a group of investors, began buying up land in Costa Rica, then in Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, and Colombia. He didn't just grow bananas, he built entire infrastructures around them: ports, railroads, telegraph lines, worker camps. The banana didn't just become a product. It became the organizing principle around which entire countries were being reorganized. In 1899, Keith merged his operation with the Boston Fruit Company to form a new enterprise. It was called the United Fruit Company. And for the next half-century, the United Fruit Company would be one of the most powerful and most feared corporations on the face of the earth. It owned more land in Central America than many of the countries themselves. It employed hundreds of thousands of workers. It controlled ports, railroads, and telegraph lines across an entire continent, and when governments got in its way, it simply had them removed. Now, here's something critical to understand. All those bananas that Minor Keith was shipping north, all the bananas that the United Fruit Company was selling by the ton, they were not the banana you eat today. They were a completely different variety. They were called the Gros Michel, and by all accounts, they were extraordinary. People who are old enough to remember the Gros Michel, or who have managed to taste one of the few remaining specimens, describe it in almost reverent terms. It was creamier than today's banana, richer, sweeter. The skin was thicker, which meant it traveled better and lasted longer. It had a complex, almost tropical flavor that lingered on the palate. Some people describe it as tasting like what banana-flavored candy is trying to taste like, that artificial banana flavor in candy and ice cream. That seems nothing like a real banana. That flavor was actually based on the Gros Michel. It was a real thing, and people loved it. The Gros Michel was perfectly suited to the United Fruit Company's model. Its thick skin made it durable during shipping. Its consistent size and color made it easy to standardize and sell. It grew in dense bunches on tall, strong plants. It was, in the language of modern business, highly scalable, and the United Fruit Company scaled it relentlessly. By the early 20th century, the banana had become something extraordinary in the American diet. In the 1880s, it was a luxury item, so unusual that vendors at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition sold individual bananas wrapped in foil for 10 cents each, a significant sum at the time. By the 1920s, it was the most popular fruit in the United States. More bananas were being consumed per capita in America than in many of the countries where they were actually grown. The United Fruit Company ran advertising campaigns telling mothers to feed their babies mashed bananas. They sponsored cookbooks. They worked with doctors to have bananas recommended as health food. It was one of the first great examples of corporate food marketing in history, and it worked spectacularly. But behind the cheerful yellow marketing was a very dark reality. The United Fruit Company didn't just sell bananas. It controlled entire nations. And the term we use today, Banana Republic, which has become a shorthand for any corrupt, poorly governed developing country, that term comes directly from this era. It was coined by the American writer O. Henry in 1904, inspired by what he saw during his time in Honduras. It wasn't meant as a compliment. Here is how the system worked. The United Fruit Company would approach the government of a small Central American or Caribbean nation. They would offer to build infrastructure, railroads, ports, telegraph lines, in exchange for something very simple. Land, enormous amounts of land, leased or given outright, at almost no cost. Often, they would also negotiate favorable tax arrangements, paying little or nothing into the national treasury despite generating enormous wealth from the country's soil. The countries needed the infrastructure badly, so they agreed. And once the deal was done, the company owned not just the land, but effectively the economic lifeblood of the nation. The workers on these banana plantations lived in company towns, bought food from company stores, and were paid in company scrip, a form of currency only accepted at company-owned establishments. It was a form of economic bondage. Workers who tried to organize, to unionize, to demand better wages or conditions were met with violence. Company enforcers, and sometimes the national armies that the company had effectively purchased, would break up meetings, arrest organizers, and in the worst cases kill them. The most horrific example of this came in 1928 in Colombia. Workers at United Fruit Company plantations in the Magdalena region had been striking for weeks, demanding basic rights, a 6-day work week, an end to payment in company scrip, access to proper medical care. The Colombian army, acting at the company's urging and with the implicit backing of the US government, which was deeply protective of American corporate interests in the region, opened fire on a crowd of striking workers. The exact death toll has never been established. Official Colombian government figures at the time claimed a handful were killed. Historians and witnesses put the number in the hundreds, possibly more. The event was so traumatic that it was immortalized in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's masterpiece, 100 Years of Solitude. Garcia Marquez grew up in that region. He heard the stories as a child. He never forgot them. This is the world that the banana built. A world of extraordinary profit for a handful of executives and shareholders in Boston and New York, and extraordinary suffering for the hundreds of thousands of people whose labor and whose land made that profit possible. And the American government was not innocent in this. Time and again, throughout the first half of the 20th century, the U.S. government intervened militarily in Central American and Caribbean nations to protect the interests of the United Fruit Company. Marines were sent to Honduras, Nicaragua, Haiti, Guatemala, not to defend democracy, but to defend dividends. Of all the chapters in the dark history of the banana, this one might be the most stunning. In 1954, the United States Central Intelligence Agency orchestrated a coup in Guatemala. The democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, was overthrown and replaced with a military dictator. The reason? He had passed a land reform law that required the United Fruit Company to give up land. It was holding idle land it owned but wasn't using, at a price the company itself had set for tax purposes. In other words, Arbenz was trying to give Guatemalan peasants access to unused land that the United Fruit Company had been sitting on for decades. The company called it communism. They had connections at the highest levels of the Eisenhower administration. The Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the CIA Director, Allen Dulles, had both previously worked for law firms that represented United Fruit. The propaganda machine swung into action. Arbenz was painted as a Soviet puppet, a communist threat in America's backyard. The CIA trained a small rebel force in Honduras. On June 18, 1954, that force crossed into Guatemala. Within 2 weeks, Arbenz had fled and a US-backed military government was in power. The coup plunged Guatemala into decades of instability and eventually civil war. Over the following decades, more than 200,000 Guatemalans were killed in that conflict, many of them indigenous Maya civilians. The roots of that catastrophe run directly back to a banana company's desire to protect its land holdings. The Guatemalan coup is one of the most well-documented examples of American corporate power overriding democracy in a foreign country, and it happened because of bananas. If that doesn't make you look at your fruit bowl differently, I'm not sure what will. And here's a callback to something we touched on earlier. Remember those company towns, that economic control, that infrastructure the company owned? By this point, United Fruit wasn't just a corporation. It was a parallel government. It had its own army, in effect, its own communication network, its own justice system on its plantations. The line between corporation and state had essentially been erased. The banana had made this possible, and now a nation's democracy paid the price. While all of this political drama was unfolding, something equally dramatic was happening in the banana fields themselves. And this is where the story pivots from empire and politics to science, ecology, and survival. Remember the Gros Michel, that magnificent, creamy, luxurious banana that Americans had come to love. It had a fatal flaw. It was extraordinarily vulnerable to a soil fungus called Fusarium oxysporum cubens. This fungus, which came to be known as Panama disease, attacks banana plants through their roots. It spreads through the soil and the water supply. It invades the plant's vascular system, blocking the flow of water and nutrients, causing the plant to wilt and die. And here is the devastating thing about Panama disease. Once it gets into the soil, it stays there for decades, possibly longer. There is no effective cure. You can't spray it away. You can't fumigate it. You can't treat infected plants. The only response is to abandon the land entirely. The first outbreaks of Panama disease in the banana plantations appeared in the early 20th century in Panama, Costa Rica, and other Central American growing regions. At first, the United Fruit Company's response was simple: move. When disease wiped out one plantation, they cleared new jungle, planted new Gros Michel, and kept going. This worked in a brutal and environmentally catastrophic way for a few decades. But jungle is finite. You can only move so many times. By the 1950s, the disease was spreading faster than the company could move. The Gros Michel, that golden fruit that had built an empire, was dying. By the early 1960s, the Gros Michel was effectively extinct as a commercial crop, gone, wiped out not by competition or consumer preference, but by a microscopic fungus in the soil. Decades of monoculture farming, growing only one variety of one plant across vast stretches of land, had created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. There was no genetic diversity to provide resistance. Every plant was essentially identical. When the fungus found one, it found all of them. And here is the sobering thought that should stay with you for the rest of this story. The banana industry's response to this catastrophe was to do the exact same thing again. After the collapse of the Gros Michel, the banana industry needed a replacement, and fast. They found it in a variety called the Cavendish, named after William Cavendish, the Duke of Devonshire, in whose greenhouses the variety had been cultivated in England in the 19th century. The Cavendish had actually been around for a long time. It was grown as a curiosity in botanical gardens. It was known to be resistant to the strain of Panama disease that had killed the Gros Michel, and it could produce large quantities of fruit on relatively compact plants. There was just one problem. By the standards of the day, the Cavendish was considered an inferior banana. It was thinner skinned, which made it bruise more easily during transport. It was blander in flavor, less creamy, less intensely sweet than the Gros Michel. Banana industry insiders knew this. Consumers, for the most part, did not. And the industry made a calculated decision. They would simply switch to the Cavendish, ramp up their marketing, and let the public forget what they had lost. It worked. Within a generation, the Cavendish became the global standard. Children who grew up eating Cavendish bananas had no memory of the Gros Michel. The artificial banana flavor in candy, still based on the Gros Michel, started to seem strange and wrong to people eating real Cavendish bananas. The disconnect between banana-flavored and banana became a running joke, when in reality it was the other way around. The candy was faithful to the original, and the fruit had changed. Today, the Cavendish accounts for roughly 50% of all bananas grown in the world, and about 99% of all bananas sold in the international export market. It is, by volume, the most exported fruit on the planet. And just like the Gros Michel before it, it is grown almost exclusively as a monoculture. Millions of acres of a single genetic clone, same plant, same DNA, same vulnerability. If you're starting to sense a pattern here, you're paying very close attention. And before we continue, if you're enjoying this journey through the wildly unexpected history of the world's most underrated fruit, it would mean the world if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more story left, and you're going to want to stick around for it. Let's take a breath here and zoom out from the drama of empires and diseases. Because the banana's story isn't just a story of economics and exploitation. It's also a story of culture, creativity, and daily life for hundreds of millions of people around the world. And in this chapter, the banana gets to be joyful for a little while. In parts of Central and West Africa, the banana, or more specifically, the plantain, its starchier cousin, is as fundamental to the diet as bread is in Europe, or rice is in Asia. In Uganda, a dish called matoke, made from cooked and mashed green bananas, is essentially the national food. In Nigeria, fried plantains called dodo are eaten at almost every meal. In Brazil, there are entire cookbooks dedicated solely to banana recipes. In Ecuador, the world's largest exporter of bananas, the fruit appears in soups, in breads, in savory stews, deep fried as snacks, dried as chips. Ecuador exports more bananas than any other country in the world, and Ecuadorians eat a staggering amount of them before any get shipped anywhere. In India, as we mentioned earlier, the banana is woven deeply into religious and spiritual life. The leaves are used as plates at ceremonial feasts. The trunk of the banana plant is used in decoration at weddings and festivals. The flower of the banana, that large, deep purple, torpedo-shaped bloom that hangs from the end of the fruit bunch, is used in cooking across South and Southeast Asia. Nothing goes to waste. Even the fibrous trunk of the plant, once the fruit is harvested, is sometimes processed into fabric or paper. The banana has also had a surprisingly significant cultural life in the West. Andy Warhol's famous cover art for the Velvet Underground's debut album in 1967, the one that just shows a single banana, white and simply drawn, became one of the most iconic album covers in rock history. The original pressing even had a peel-off element, revealing a pink banana underneath. That image of a single banana became shorthand for an entire artistic era. Banana peels, of course, have been a staple of physical comedy for over a century. The slipping on a banana peel gag dates back to at least the 1860s in the United States, when banana consumption was just beginning and peels were regularly discarded on city sidewalks. It became such a genuine public safety hazard that some cities passed laws against littering banana peels. The comedy came from reality, and it persisted in theatre, film, and cartoon for over 100 years. There's something almost philosophical about the banana peel as a comedy device. The idea that even the most ordinary innocent thing can bring you crashing down without warning, which, as we've seen, is rather true of the banana in general. Let's talk about what's actually inside a banana, because for all the geopolitical drama and cultural significance, the banana's most direct relationship with most people is a purely nutritional one. You eat it. It does things for your body. What things, exactly? The banana is one of the most complete single food packages in nature. A medium banana contains roughly 100 calories, which is a modest amount for the satiety it provides. It contains about 27 grams of carbohydrates, most of which, in a less ripe banana, come in the form of resistant starch, a type of carbohydrate that your digestive system doesn't fully break down, which feeds beneficial gut bacteria and helps regulate blood sugar. As the banana ripens and those resistant starches convert to simple sugars, the fruit becomes sweeter and more immediately energizing, but also slightly less beneficial for blood sugar control. Bananas are famously rich in potassium. A medium banana provides about 420 milligrams, roughly 12% of your daily recommended intake. Potassium is essential for heart health, for maintaining healthy blood pressure, and for proper muscle function. Athletes have known about the banana's power for decades. The image of a tennis player eating a banana between sets is practically iconic, and it's not just for show. The combination of fast-releasing carbohydrates and potassium makes the banana one of the best natural sports recovery foods available. Bananas also contain significant amounts of vitamin B6, which plays a role in brain health and mood regulation, as well as vitamin C, magnesium, and small amounts of iron and zinc. The riper the banana, the higher its antioxidant content. Those dark spots on an overripe banana, those are actually a marker of increased antioxidant activity, specifically a compound called tumor necrosis factor, which some early research has suggested may have immune-boosting properties. That's not a reason to eat only rotten bananas, but it is a reason not to throw them away. Old bananas are actually nutritionally excellent, and they make wonderful banana bread, which is, in its own small way, one of the great accidental culinary inventions of the 20th century. The green, unripe banana has its own set of benefits, particularly for digestive health. In parts of the developing world, green banana flour has become an important nutritional tool, particularly for children with diarrheal diseases, because its resistant starch content helps firm stool and reduce gut inflammation. Research into the medicinal properties of various parts of the banana plant, not just the fruit, but the flower, the stem, the leaves, is ongoing. Traditional medicine systems across South Asia and Africa have used different parts of the banana plant for everything from wound healing to treating kidney stones. Modern pharmacology is only beginning to catch up. The global banana trade today is worth approximately $25 billion annually. It is one of the most valuable agricultural commodities in the world, alongside wheat, rice, corn, and soybeans. And yet, for all that value, the people who actually grow bananas, the farmers, the plantation workers, the harvesters in Ecuador, Honduras, the Philippines, and Cameroon, receive a tiny, almost insulting fraction of that money. Here is a number that will stay with you. For a bunch of bananas that you might buy at a supermarket in the United Kingdom or the United States, for roughly £1 or $1.50, the farmer who grew those bananas typically receives something in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 cents per kilogram at the farm gate. The shipping company, the importer, the distributor, and the supermarket take the rest. The system that Minor Keith and the United Fruit Company built in the 19th century, a system designed to extract maximum profit from tropical land and tropical labor for the benefit of northern corporations and consumers, is still in its essential shape the system that operates today. The major banana trading companies have changed names and ownership over the decades. The United Fruit Company became Chiquita Brands. Standard Fruit Company became Dole. The Del Monte Company carved out its own significant share. But the fundamental dynamic, wealthy northern consumers paying very little for a commodity grown by impoverished southern workers, has changed less than anyone would like to admit. Fair trade certification has made some inroads. Organic banana production has grown. Consumer awareness about labor conditions on banana plantations has increased. But these are drops in a very large bucket. The vast majority of bananas sold globally are still grown under conditions that provide their workers with minimal wages, limited protections, and significant exposure to the pesticides and fungicides that are used in enormous quantities on banana plantations. The banana plantation is, in terms of pesticide use per acre, one of the most chemically intensive agricultural environments in the world. Workers who spray those chemicals often do so with inadequate protective equipment. The health consequences are severe and well documented. The story of who benefits from the banana and who bears its costs is not a story that has resolved itself. It is very much still unfolding. And now we arrive at the existential threat, the one that scientists are losing sleep over, the one that could within our lifetime do to the Cavendish what Panama disease did to the Gros Michel. It's called Tropical Race 4 or TR4. It is a new strain of the same Fusarium oxysporum fungus that killed the Gros Michel. And unlike the original strain of Panama disease, which the Cavendish was resistant to, TR4 infects the Cavendish with devastating effectiveness. It was first identified in Taiwan in the 1990s. Since then, it has spread with alarming speed. TR4 is now confirmed in over 20 countries. It has devastated banana plantations in Southeast Asia, Australia, the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Latin America, the very heartland of Cavendish production. The spread is relentless. Unlike some agricultural diseases that can be contained with the right pesticides or quarantine measures, TR4 is extraordinarily difficult to stop. The fungus can survive in soil for decades. It spreads through contaminated soil on boots, on farm equipment, in irrigation water. It has spread from plantation to plantation, country to country, on the soles of workers' shoes. A microscopic hitchhiker that is rewriting the future of the world's most popular fruit. The economic consequences are already severe. In some parts of Southeast Asia, TR4 has destroyed plantations that had been productive for generations. Farmers have lost their livelihoods. In some cases, entire banana growing industries in specific regions have been wiped out. And if TR4 continues to spread at its current rate, if it reaches the massive Cavendish plantations of Ecuador, Colombia, and Costa Rica, which together supply the majority of the world's exported bananas, the disruption to global food supply and the economic devastation in those countries would be catastrophic. There is, as yet, no commercially viable chemical treatment for TR4. No fungicide works. No spraying regime controls it. The only effective strategy, once a plantation is infected, is to abandon it. Which is, of course, exactly what was done during the Gros Michel crisis, and which eventually failed because the disease spread faster than farmers could move. History is rhyming loudly. So is the banana doomed? Not necessarily. And this is where the story takes a genuinely hopeful turn, though with significant caveats. Scientists around the world are working on multiple fronts to save the banana. The most straightforward approach is old-fashioned breeding. Researchers at institutions like the Biodiversity International in Belgium, the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture in Nigeria, and various university programs are working to develop new banana varieties that combine TR4 resistance with consumer-acceptable taste and texture. This is harder than it sounds. Bananas don't breed easily. They don't produce viable seeds in the way most plants do. Remember, the seedlessness that ancient farmers cultivated is now a genetic fact, and it means bananas can only reproduce asexually. Breeding new varieties requires unusual techniques and takes many years. Some of the most promising TR4-resistant varieties being developed are hybrids, crosses between the Cavendish and wild banana relatives that have natural resistance to the fungus. Early results have been encouraging. Some of these hybrid varieties have excellent TR4 resistance and produce fruit that, in taste tests, scores reasonably well. The challenge is getting these varieties to the scale needed to replace the Cavendish globally, which is an enormous logistical undertaking measured in decades, not years. On the cutting edge of the science, researchers have been exploring genetic modification. In Australia, a team led by Professor James Dale at Queensland University of Technology spent years developing a genetically modified Cavendish banana that incorporates a gene from a wild, TR4-resistant banana relative. Field trials showed the GM banana was highly resistant to TR4 while producing fruit that looked and tasted like a conventional Cavendish. Similar work is being done in Belgium and the United States. The science is promising. The regulatory, commercial, and public acceptance hurdles are enormous, particularly in Europe, where consumer resistance to GM food remains strong. There is also a growing movement, spurred by the TR4 crisis, to diversify banana cultivation, to move away from total Cavendish monoculture and bring back some of the hundreds of other banana varieties that exist in the world. Varieties with different flavors, textures, and shapes. Varieties that are naturally resistant to different diseases. Varieties that have been grown and loved in their home regions for centuries, but that never made it onto supermarket shelves because they didn't fit the standardized mold that global supply chains demanded. If TR4 does ultimately devastate the Cavendish, this diversification might be the most durable long-term solution, and here is a thought worth sitting with. The global banana monoculture that created this crisis was not an accident, and it was not inevitable. It was a choice made by corporations maximizing profit, by supply chains prioritizing efficiency over resilience, by consumers in wealthy countries who wanted cheap, uniform, predictable fruit. The TR4 crisis is, in a very real sense, a consequence of those choices. And the solutions will require different choices. Choices that value biodiversity, that support small farmers growing diverse varieties, that accept some variation in size and appearance in exchange for a more resilient food system. Here is something genuinely wonderful to think about. While the Cavendish dominates supermarket shelves in Europe, North America, and East Asia, much of the rest of the world eats completely different bananas, and many of them are extraordinary. In the Philippines, there is a variety called the Lakatan, longer, more slender than the Cavendish, with a subtle floral sweetness. In Southeast Asia, the Pisang Raja, king banana, is considered by many to be the finest eating banana in the world. It's smaller than the Cavendish, with a deep golden skin that turns almost orange when ripe, and a flavor described as rich, honey-like, almost wine-like in its complexity. In East Africa, the apple banana, a small, stubby variety sometimes called the manzano, tastes faintly of apple and strawberry when fully ripe. In India, the Nay Puvan and the red banana varieties have devoted followings. The red banana, with its deep burgundy skin and creamy vanilla-tinged flesh, is a revelation to anyone who has only ever eaten a Cavendish. And then there are the plantains. Plantains are bananas. Let's be absolutely clear about that. There is no botanical distinction between a banana and a plantain. Plantain is simply a culinary term used in Western countries to refer to cooking varieties of Musa. In Latin America, West Africa, and the Caribbean, plantains are not a side note to the banana story. They are the banana story. They are the dietary staple. They are eaten green, fried hard and crunchy as tostones. They are eaten ripe, fried golden and caramelized as maduros. They are boiled, mashed, stuffed, baked, and dried. They are as versatile as a potato, as satisfying as bread, and in the right hands, as luxurious as anything you'll find in a Michelin-starred restaurant. The diversity of the banana world is astonishing. And the fact that most people in wealthy Western countries have only ever tasted one of over 1,000 varieties is both a loss and an opportunity. A loss because of the extraordinary flavors that corporate supply chains have crowded out. An opportunity because those flavors are still out there. In Asian grocery stores, in Caribbean markets, in specialty stores, in your own backyard, if you live somewhere warm enough to grow them. The banana's future might look a lot more like its past. Diverse, varied, locally rooted, and wonderfully surprising. There is one more existential challenge facing the banana that we haven't yet discussed, and it may be the most fundamental of all: climate change. Bananas are tropical plants. They thrive in warm, humid conditions with consistent rainfall. The world is getting warmer and, in many tropical regions, wetter in some seasons and more severely drought-stricken in others. Climate change is reshaping the growing conditions in the regions where bananas are produced, and the effects are already being felt. In parts of East Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, rising temperatures and increasingly erratic rainfall patterns are stressing banana crops. The highland regions where bananas have been grown for centuries are seeing changes in pest and disease pressure as the climate shifts. Some of the insect pests that were once limited by cooler highland temperatures are now moving upslope as those temperatures rise. Diseases are spreading into regions they couldn't previously reach. At the same time, the carbon footprint of the global banana supply chain is substantial. Bananas grown in Ecuador must be shipped thousands of miles to reach consumers in Europe or the United States. Refrigerated container ships burn significant amounts of fuel. The cold storage facilities at ports and in distribution centers consume enormous quantities of electricity. For a product marketed partly on the basis of its nutritional wholesomeness, the environmental cost of delivering a banana from field to fork is higher than most consumers realize, but there is nuance here. The banana is also, in many ways, one of the most carbon-efficient foods available. Per calorie delivered, bananas have a lower carbon footprint than most animal products and many other fruits. They are grown in the tropics, where solar energy is abundant and yields per acre are high. They require no irrigation in many growing regions, relying instead on tropical rainfall. They produce no significant methane, unlike cattle. If you are a person concerned about the environmental impact of your diet, the banana, even accounting for transport, is still one of the better choices you can make. The problem is not the banana itself, it's the system around it. That system, the global agricultural and shipping infrastructure that connects tropical farms to northern supermarkets, is going to need to adapt to a changing climate. That means more drought-resistant varieties, better water management, reduced chemical inputs, and supply chains that can handle greater variability in growing conditions. It means supporting the small-scale farmers and diverse growing systems that are, paradoxically, far more resilient to climate disruption than the vast monocultures that currently dominate production. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the jungle floors of ancient Papua New Guinea to the boardrooms of the United Fruit Company. from the plates of Roman explorers to the slides of modern geneticists. From the massacre of striking banana workers in Colombia to the hopeful laboratory experiments trying to save the Cavendish from TR4, the banana has been with us through all of it. Patient, yellow, quietly extraordinary. What does all of this tell us? I think it tells us several things. It tells us that the foods we take for granted are never simple. Every item in your kitchen has a history of people, power, land, labor, and time. The banana has made that history more visible than almost any other food, and the story isn't always comfortable. But discomfort in the face of truth is, I would argue, a necessary part of being an informed person in the world. It tells us that monoculture is fragile. The same lesson that wiped out the Gros Michel is still being written with the Cavendish. When we strip away diversity, whether in agriculture, in economies, in ecosystems, we create systems that are efficient and profitable right up until the moment they catastrophically collapse. The banana is a perfect, edible metaphor for the dangers of putting too many eggs in one basket. Or, to use a more appropriate metaphor, too many bananas in one bunch. It tells us that corporations, left unchecked, will sacrifice almost anything for profit. Workers, ecosystems, democracies. The history of the United Fruit Company is extreme, but it is not an anomaly. It is a particularly vivid example of a pattern that repeats throughout industrial history. And the same dynamics that allowed United Fruit to operate as a shadow government in Central America in the 1950s, the dynamics of weak regulation, corrupted governance, and consumer indifference are still present in the global supply chains that bring us our food today. And finally, it tells us that there is always hope, not passive, wishful hope, but active, scientific, agricultural, political hope. The researchers working on TR4-resistant bananas, the farmers diversifying their crops, the consumers seeking out fair trade products and local variety, the organizations working to protect the genetic diversity of wild banana relatives in seed banks and conservation programs. These are the people writing the next chapter of this story. And that chapter is not yet finished. The banana, that cheap, yellow, slightly squishy fruit, is still here. Still feeding billions of people every day. Still sweet, still generous, still, in its quiet way, one of the most important plants in the history of human civilization. Next time you pick one up, maybe give it a second thought. It has earned it before we wrap up today. If you've made it this far on this journey through 10,000 years of banana history, you are clearly someone who loves learning the hidden stories behind everyday things. I'd be so grateful if you'd take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more curious people find content like this, and it keeps me motivated to keep digging into the stories that don't make the headlines but probably should. Thanks for being here, and as always, keep peeling back the layers. This has been the history of the banana. Thanks for listening.